On my end.
Thank you. Good to hear. So when we see that button, it'll say live. Oh, all right. I think we're live. So let's go ahead and get started. Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Grants Branch session, Show Me the Money, Ways to Avoid Award Delays. My name is Angela Mendiola, and I'm a team lead in our Grants Branch here at EPA Region 9. And I'm excited to be here with my fellow colleagues today to cover a number of topics. So Susan Chui, Region 9 Grants Branch, and Julie Milazzo from our EPA Office of Grants and Debarment will give us the latest and greatest in grant updates. Following, myself and Cliff Banuelos from the Intertribal Council of Nevada will cover common application errors and ways that we can avoid award delays. Finally, Nelly Sun from our Region 9 Grants Branch will help us wrap up everything we learned today and we created to help you remember all the do's and don'ts with your award applications. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, and we'll be questions as they come up in the chat. So please definitely use that feature. So with that, let's go ahead and begin, and I'll pass the mic over to Susan.
Hi, good morning, everyone. If you have not noticed, there is a poll that we have started. If you go to your chat box, right next to the chat, there's a poll. So if you want to answer the polls, that will be great. So for my slide, it starts with highlights of EPA implementation of OMB regulatory changes. And these changes went into effect November 12, 2020. I added the link to the Office of Grants Debarment website, which has a summary, but we want to highlight certain things for our Region 9 grantees. Now, some of these, we have to make sure to remind the grantees to update your written policies and procedures, as you will see later on about my. So the first thing that I want to mention is that the acronym CFDA, Catalog for Federal Domestic Assistance, is now replaced with the term assistance listing. So when you see CFDA, we now call it assistance listing. The second thing we want to mention is the micro purchase procurement method for supplies and services. Now, this is a method that was added to the regulations, and it has a dollar threshold. It's a simple procurement method. The threshold is right now $10,000 aggregate. So you must have this in your written policies and procedures. So like any other procurement method, you have to establish the tribe's procedures on how the tribe will use this procurement method. So EPA has a RAIN. RAIN stands for Recipient Applicant Information Notice. So if you click on the link, Office of Grants Debarment has a RAIN about this. The next thing we want to mention, which is important, is the regulation change regarding grant closeout. All grantees now has 120 days from the project period end date for submission to EPA, all financial, performance, and other deliverables for the purpose of grant closeout. So rather than 90 days, it changed to 120 days. And you can click on the link to the EPA's general term and conditions, and also a very, very helpful frequently asked question about closeouts, which was developed by Office of Grants and Debarment. The next thing is the federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. OMB now requires federal agencies to have a central place to add copies of approved negotiated agreements, but it excludes tribes and tribal organizations. Therefore, the tribal grantees must provide EPA a copy of its most current indirect cost rate agreement with EPA grant applications. So if you have indirect costs included in your budget, you must include a copy of your indirect cost rate agreement. Next slide, Angela. Okay, so we also want to mention the COVID flexibilities for grants, the FAQ, the frequently asked questions. And we again want to emphasize that you should contact your EPA project officer and grant specialist immediately should you have questions about COVID related issues about your grant, work plan, or needing a grant extension, etc. If you don't know who your project officer or grant specialist is, look at your award document. On page 1, it gives you the name and contact information for your project officer and grant specialist. And I included the link here for the EPA's frequently asked questions about COVID. The next thing we want to mention is that EPA has renewed its application forms with OMB, and it was included in was updated in September 23rd. We want to remind all our tribal grantees that this the lobbying form 6600-06 is required if the cumulative amount, federal amount on the award is over 100,000. This is a one-time form that the grantee must submit if the federal amount is over 100,000. And it will delay your award. It will stop your award if it's missing from your application. And the other thing we want to mention, which is really important, is that on the grants.gov, the forms in grants.gov has replaced the DUNS number with the unique entity identifier. And that's in the form, standard form 424 and EPA form 4700-4. So be sure to use the most current forms that's available in grants.gov. The last thing we want to remind our grantees is that please respond to questions from Research Triangle Park Finance Center in a timely fashion, because when they send you a question, it's important. It's most likely important. It may have to do with your drawdown. It may have to do with audit, etc. So the point of contact at RTP for Region 9 is Cassandra Leon. And we have included her email, her phone number, and to remind you to submit your interim and annual federal financial reports to the email address at rtpfc-grants@epa.gov. And that's my 2 slides. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Susan. So with that, we'll go ahead and pass the mic over to Julie Milazzo, who's going to give us some updates from headquarters. So go for it, Julie.
Thanks, Angela. So I have some good news. First of all, can you guys hear me, Angela? Am I coming through clear now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, wonderful. So I have some excellent news. Our office approved on September 30th a regulatory class exception for tribes. It applies to tribal PPGs, and it makes It's so that as of October 1st, 2022, cost share is no longer required for PPGs. So that means if you have programs going into a PPG, you can budget with $0, 0% cost share. We know that there are some awards maybe being made right about now where you had applied including cost share because of the regulatory requirements, and maybe they were awarded with cost share. But if you did get a new award or a supplemental award on or after October 1st, 2021, you can have that amended and have that cost share removed. This regulatory cost share exception does not apply to anything awarded in fiscal year 2021. So up to September 30th, cost share still applies. But moving forward, we think that this is going to be a pretty big efficiency. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the regulations at 40 CFR 35536, but they're mind-boggling. So I'm really, really happy that no one has to understand what they say anymore and try to figure out. And that also means that for new and supplemental awards or any awards, going forward when you're doing the budget and all of that and figuring out your cost share, you don't have to ask for a hardship waiver. You don't have to are maybe going up to 10%, or the region asking you for socioeconomic data to try to make a determination. All of that is gone until the regulations can be updated to remove the cost share requirements. So hopefully that's really, really good news. Let's see, and I know that there might be some questions coming, but we think that that's going to be just a huge efficiency. We did send out a RAIN 2022-G01. If you are not receiving RAINs, those are the recipient applicant information notices. I have a link here. You can sign up for a listserv. And so you'll be getting communications from my office, the Office of Grants and Debarment, about all of these things that Susan was talking about just a few moments ago. And this, so it's really helpful to be signed up for that. You might want multiple people signed up because different things might apply differently. So I highly recommend getting signed up for our listserv if you are not currently. You might get some good news in there, like regulatory class exceptions for tribal PPG cost share. One quick note, this does not apply to the standalone programs. So this is only for PPGs right now. We're doing some research to see if it could be extended, but for right now, this is only for PPGs. So yes, definitely not standalone program grants. That's correct, Destiny. Thank you. I think we can move on to the next slide. So Susan had also mentioned that there were some updates to OMB's regulations at 2 CFR 200. One of them is more additional good news. The 10% de minimis rate, you can now use it if you don't have a negotiated rate and you no longer have to apply for a regulatory exception from my office, the Office of Grants and Debarment. The old regulations required that you could only use it if you'd never had a rate before, and we didn't love that. We think 10% is an okay amount and you shouldn't have to jump through hoops for it. And OMB now agrees. So if you want to use a 10% rate, if you're having a hard time negotiating rates, if you're, if you don't have the capacity to apply for negotiated rates, all you have to do is put that 10% rate into your budget when you're applying for grants, and you can use it indefinitely until you have a negotiated rate if you choose to go in that direction. So that's pretty exciting too. That's a burden reduction. And then the last thing is we're still doing a regulatory exception offering for continued use of expired rates. If you've had a rate that's expired within the last 3 years or so, you can apply for a regulatory exception to continue using that rate for EPA grants only. We can't, awarding agencies are allowed to do it just for their awards. So if you know that you do want to apply for negotiated rates, you're working on it, maybe you're behind, maybe the Interior Business Center is a little behind or something, you can apply for a regulatory exception to continue using your most recently approved rate, even if it's expired. So I've included a link in here to the guidance. And if you look at page 3, it has instructions on how to apply for that regulatory exception. It just wants basic information from you, you know, name, address, what you need an exception from, and a quick justification. But we understand that, especially with the pandemic and everything, and a lot of turnover, there are some real hardships. So hopefully these exception opportunities and the use of the 10% rate can help reduce burden for all of you at some point. And let's see, I'm looking at, I mean, at the 10%, so I just got a question. Can this 10% de minimis rate be used on 106-319 grants as well? We use that on GAP, but haven't been able to on 106-319. I believe it's for, it's available for any, it should be available for all programs. So if you want to contact me after this, we can talk about maybe the issues that you've come up with. And I can just make sure that there aren't things that would prevent it from being used for 106-319, but I would think that it could be used for, you know, any grant. So you are more than welcome to contact me after this. Hopefully my email information is included somewhere, and I can throw that into the chat as well, along with my phone number. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Julie. And we do have all of our contact information in the last slide of our presentation.
Okay.
Awesome.
Right. Excellent. I'll leave it alone then. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, awesome. We were having some audio issues earlier. So, all right, so now we'll proceed with our next section and discuss the most common application errors we saw this past award season. So please note that this is not an all-inclusive list, but rather addresses the most common errors that we saw with the biggest impact. So before we begin, let's talk about why this is even important. Why should you care about common application errors? Well, errors like these cause significant delays in the EPA award process. So we're giving this presentation today to share ways for you to help avoid getting a late award and to help you get your award money on time and do the important environmental work in your communities. Also, our goal is to save you, your finance office, your senior leaders, etc., time by not having to go back and forth, re-sign forms, redo forms, anything like that, so that you can go ahead and have a complete application. So by giving attention to these issues, we're hoping that when you're ready to submit your next application to EPA, you know what to do, you know the resources that are available, and who to call for help if you need, so that you can have a complete and successful EPA grant application. So there are 3 main categories that we'll cover, and we'll cover each of these points more in depth in the coming slides. So let's go ahead and start with the first major category. So this is one of the common application errors we saw most frequently was not submitting all required forms. So Susan touched on the importance of the certification regarding lobbying. This was probably the #1 missing form last year, in which applicants did not submit this form. We also saw incomplete or unsigned forms. And let's move on to the next category here. So incomplete 424As. So this is your summary of your cost categories. And we noticed that for applicants that were applying for programs that had required match, that in this particular form, that the total project and budget amounts did not include both the federal and the non-federal match. So we did include a template here, and we'll share it with you here in the next coming slides. We also noticed a miscategorization of items. So for example, putting outreach supplies in other rather than in supplies. And again, we'll show you a sample of how you can do that for your next application. The last category of common application errors is having an incomplete budget detail. So this is the form in which you can flesh out what exactly you intend to do with that budgeted amount per cost category. So we noticed that there were some particular areas of the budget detail that needed more information. And also, this was a big one too, that the totals in this form in your budget detail did not necessarily match the SF424A. So we'll walk through each one of these and provide more detail on those. So to avoid having an incomplete application, we created this checklist. This checklist you can find in our Region 9 application guide. This is all of the list of all of the EPA required forms. So I'm not going to go through each one of these in detail because it is designed here to checklist style. We're also going to have an opportunity to see a tool that we created for you to help you understand more in depth about each one of these that we'll present to you as a resource towards the end. But I wanted to highlight this one form here in yellow. So this is, again, that lobbying form. I know we already talked about it twice. Susan mentioned it, I mentioned it earlier. But we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the lobbying form because, again, this was one of the #1 culprit for award delays was that not having this particular form. The next point that we want to make sure we mention is, as you heard Susan mention earlier, the use of the UEI numbers. So this will be a requirement as of April 4th, 2022. So as we're looking forward and looking at applying for your next award, we wanted to highlight some potential, setbacks that you might have if this is not, if you do not have a UEI number. So what is this UEI number? It is a unique entity identifier. And as we said already, on April 4th, 2022, the US government will switch from using a DUNS number to this new unique entity identifying number. So we're going to just list here kind of where we are with the transition. So we are in this middle stage here that at this time, there are still some organizations using DUNS, and then we have some organizations have already adopted the UEI, but come April 4th, it will only be UEI. So you've seen this, or you've heard this already. Susan mentioned some of the forms that are impacted, your 424A, your EPA form 4700-4. So let's go ahead and look at some of those forms. So in those two forms in particular, what you're going to see different is this additional field. So you're going to see this field here that actually says UEI. So this is where you would put that UEI number. So we wanted to just give you a sample of what that's going to look like in the new forms. So great news. If you've already registered in SAM.gov, you do not need to do anything else because you've already been assigned a new unique entity ID. So in order for you to verify that, we recommend that you actually go look at your entity registration. So go into SAM.gov and take a look, and you should be able to see your UEI on that page. If you need assistance with SAM.gov or have any other technical issues, we recommend you go to this site here, fsg.gov, search for the frequently asked questions. We also included a link here on what do you need to know about the new UEI. So we hope that that helps you as you plan ahead for your next few applications. So moving on to the certification regarding lobbying. I know we've talked about this already, but let's take a look at the form. So this is what it looks like. This is probably one of the simplest forms in government you're probably ever going to have to look at and fill out. It literally is a one-pager. All you do here is type your name or type the name and the title of the authorized representative, sign and date. There is a field up here if you want to include your grant number if you know it, and that's it. So that's literally the form. The reason that this is really important is because unlike the other forms, like your budget detail or your budget, or your 424A, for example, as allowed, we can pen and ink certain fields, right? We can say, okay, there's a change here, and as we can, we'll pen and ink it. There's no pen and inking this form if we don't have it. So we just want to make sure that we're reminding that if your award has a cumulative amount of 100,000 or more, this form is required. Also, I thought I saw something in the chat saying, is this for the recipient or for the life of the award? So this form is only required for the life of that award. So you only have to do it once. So moving on to the next common application error, so having an incomplete SF424A. So this is a sample of what a 424A looks like. You'll see here that it's broken out by the cost categories: personnel, fringe, travel, etc. And what we noticed was that we received a lot of forms like these, but they only included this column 1 for federal. When an applicant applies for a program that requires match, that has a match requirement, it is required that you include a column 2 here, and you include the recipient match. So your total, for your total project cost, you'll see here 281,673 includes both the federal and the recipient match. So we wanted to show you a sample of that and what does that look like. This is a sample of a budget detail. You'll see here that this fleshes out all of the details per cost category, so it gives more information. And there were a few areas that we noticed that we had the grant specialist had to go back and forth with the grantee or the project officer and say, hey, tell me more about this. So what we're hoping to do is provide you with some samples and information up front so that we can avoid a lot of that back and forth. So one of the areas we noticed needed more information and required that back and forth was in the supplies area. So a common error we saw is that folks were putting like outreach supplies and other instead of putting it here in the supply category. So there are a few ways that you can organize your supply categories. So for example, in this case, you see office supplies. You can also include program supplies and outreach supplies as well. And we're just showing you a sample here. You know, so for in this case, office supplies, you'll see it includes pens, pencils, paper, chairs. You don't have to list the 55 pens and 10 pencils, but just mainly just get a gist and an idea of what is included in this category here. So travel. So we also noticed that we had to go back and forth and get clarification on this section as well. So under travel, one of the go-tos that we say is, the 5 W's: who, what, why, when, and where. So make sure that all that information is included up front as you're budgeting to make it very clear to your project officer as well as your grant specialist what exactly you intend to do with the money you are requesting. And lastly, in the other category, so like I mentioned earlier, we've seen outreach supplies thrown in here in this cost category, which required us to go back and ask the recipient to move it over. In some cases, actually redo the 424A. So to avoid that, just being very mindful of the types of costs that, and projected costs that you anticipate having, and being really mindful of what items you should be putting into this category. If you have any subawards or participant support costs, for example, they would belong here in the other category. So just to summarize a little bit, do a quick summary. So to avoid delays in your award, we recommend that you definitely review the Region 9 application guide for FY 2022. We are currently updating it with the latest and greatest updates and things like that. So once that is complete, we'll share it out with you. But we also recommend calling your grant specialist and requesting it as well. Susan mentioned earlier in the first part of that grant update section that if you don't know who your grant specialist is, take a look at your grant award. On page 1 at the top, you'll see a name for your project officer and you'll see a name for your grant specialist. So we recommend definitely reaching out if you want to get help and have questions and or get the latest copy of the Region 9 application guide. We'll also be providing, like I said before, a checklist that Nelly Sun will cover as well to help you provide some more information about what to include in your application. We also encourage you to double check, make sure you have all the required forms, they're signed appropriately and included. And the two things that we've seen, IDC, so are you applying for IDC? And please definitely include your approved rate agreement. That'll save us time back and forth if it's all there up front. And then the last, we'll hit it again, certification regarding lobbying. This is required for federal funding award is greater than $100,000 for the life of the grant. Please, 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 please make sure that you are checking that box if that applies for the funding that you are requesting. And the last reminder, is to register. So check your SAM.gov registration. Is it up to date? Is it about to expire soon? Make sure you're keeping up with that because, like we said already, April 4th, 2022, recipients must use a UEI so the unique entity identifier rather than the DUNS. So don't wait to register and do as much as you can ahead of time. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Cliff to offer us a tribal perspective in his take.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, a few things I wanted to go over. So, having done these things before in the past, so you're on grants.gov, and now you have to. Last few years, you have to open up a workspace. I've been in that boat, and it gives a drop-down menu of all the forms. And unfortunately, some of these forms I find aren't on there. That's why it's really important to read the notification of funding availability, the NOFA, and EPA. The last few years have put down this really good comprehensive NOFA. They have a NOFA, and then they have all these little help resources to help you put it together. And then one of the final pages is grants.gov, and as Andrew just said, your SAM registration is part of that. But so you need to know those forms and have that checklist available. And how I'm tying into the SAM is often I'm finding that tribes, you as a program person putting in the grant application, you actually physically might not be doing it. Someone from your administration or a grant writer, someone might actually be inputting the grant application. And somewhere between you and the person inputting it, they're not seeing the lobbying form and a few other forms. And so they need to be, you need to communicate to them all these on the checklist of the forms that are needed. And then make sure, one thing I'd recommend doing is making sure you have the access level as an authorized organizational representative, AOR. Make sure you have the access level to actually submit a grant, because they may not understand how it works on the SAM system and grants.gov. So make sure you at least have AOR level to do the workspace. And then as you submit it, then your administration approves your application, because you have to have the eBiz point of contact approve the application for you. And I think that's where administration council is confused. They don't understand that the program people can do the application, but the final approval is done by administration for the application. So, and there are other forms in there. So you may have your resolution of support, letter approving the grant application, whatever document the tribe uses to say, hey, we approve this application. You have to submit them usually on the SF424 as an attachment. One thing, maps. So maybe your tribe has grown, they have more land, and your project officer for GAP or whatever would wants you to show the map showing your increased area. So you include those things as attachments on the SF424A, I believe it is, but that's where you let them know if they don't want to set you as an AOR status to submit a grant, that these are the things that need to be attached to it. You kind of need to hold the hand of whoever's submitting it for you, and that way you can bypass these things that could delay your grant approval. Also, you can also get on the horn. You get on the email or phone and talk to the grant specialist directly. I did that a couple times. I would sit down with the finance director, myself, and then whoever from finance in a call, or these days a virtual call, to iron out these details. Maybe your administrator or chairman want to be in that call because they just don't trust you. They don't, you can tell them, but I've worked there. I've worked for my tribe, and no matter what you say, they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. So just arrange a meeting with them. And so I let the grants specialists know this. Be aware each different tribe has an organizational structure, a chain of command, a personnel policy, a financial policy, and they kind of have to follow that. And maybe when they're pitching the new policy, you can go, well, this needs to be changed because it's stalling or delaying the process for simple applications. Set us up as an AOR so we can, or approve us as an AOR with the access level to submit these grants by yourself, and then you just approve it. It's easier for you. It's easier for me. It's easier for the funding agency. And then, a few things I also added is so we have a lot of new tribal personnel. EPA seems to focus their coaching between GAP, PO, and grantee, but I'd like to see more GAP, I'm sorry, grant specialist to grantee. So I'm amazed when I talk to a tribe how many of you don't know your grant specialist. You got to know them. You got to at least communicate through email and develop a relationship, because with these financial things that come up, you're creating another barrier that's going to slow the process if you're talking to your project officer when it's really a grant specialist thing. So maybe just communicating with the grant specialist, CCing the PO to let them know what's happening in the communication, but you can communicate directly with your grant specialist. If you're unsure, you can ask the PO, but I find the grant specialists are more readily available than the GAP POs. That's sorry, guys, if you want to hear that, but they are. They return the calls back faster, and they return back the emails faster, in my experience. And that's kind of what I wanted to go over, because and also here, I'm here, ITCN, I'm here in Nevada at least. If you have any of these questions, I can try to direct you the right way. But develop those relationships with your grant specialist and your PO for these reasons, because during this process, it's going to make things go faster. That's kind of just really what I wanted to pitch in. I think we wanted to leave some extra time for questions. Angela?
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. So let's go ahead and just do a couple, just a recap summary of what we covered today and just share some resources, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. So Nelly, were you able to get back on? I know we're having some audio issues.
Yes, I was. Thank you, Angela. May I take on at this point?
Please do. Yes, please do.
Okay. Hi, everyone. We recognize that there's a lot of new information and updates to learn and absorb from this session. And so what we did was we've tied all this information together so that it will be super easy to apply it for recall purposes. And as you know, much like it makes perfect sense to have a shopping list of all the items that you'll need when you go to the grocery store, our grants branch created a shopping list sort of a grant application checklist that will serve a similar purpose. So what you'll see here is that one pager of a shopping list for you. And if you look at the left side, you'll see that there are 9 forms that you'll need. But for majority of our tribal recipients, you only need the first 8. The 9 is always optional. And then the last page would show step-by-step for each form what you'll need to remember. Oh, I have to have my SAM, .gov, current, etc. So going to the next slide. Okay, so there's the first one. Thanks, Angela. So the first one is about the SF424 itself. So they're talked about is your SAM.gov current and the funding amounts correct. There's 2 main takeaways I wanted to share with all of you here. With the SAM.gov, the other imperative reason that you need to have that current is that our ASAP system, database system, is programmed in such a way that it recognizes only current SAM registration. So what that means that if you're trying to do a drawdown and your SAM registration is current, the system would not allow you to make that drawdown. So it makes really important sense to have your SAM.gov registration current. And then secondly, the other important part is periodically, Congress may occasionally release additional funds for you for your grant program. And your PO may notify you and say that, hey, we're giving you additional funds for your grant application. So that's really great news. And when that happens, what we would require of you is that you will be doing something called a pen and ink change on your SF424, meaning on that section 18 of your SF424 where it lists down the EPA funding, all you need to simply do is cross out the old amount. Let's say it's 100,000 and cross it out to 150,000. And then if there's a recipient cost share involved in there, so just adjust that amount, proportionally to it. Same thing with your budget detail. If you're having an increase in EPA funding, you'll need to modify your budget accordingly to that. And then next row, please. So in here, the SF424A, Angela and Susan had already summarized it in earlier, wherein for the column 1, that's where you're going to put your EPA funding. And then column B is your cost share portion if your grant requires a cost share. And then on column 5, that's when you put the cumulative total for both the EPA and your recipient share. And then next row, please. Here, the budget detail, as had mentioned earlier, most of the grant application errors occur in the budget detail, wherein there's a miscalculation of, let's say, the cost categories in there. So it's important that you select the correct object class code, like if it's supplies, it's indeed the supplies, and equipment, it's an equipment. So case in point, for example, let's say you're purchasing an air monitoring instrument for $7,000. So in the federal regulations, equipment is defined as something that's $5,000 or over. So that's definitely something that you're going to put into equipment versus a computer laptop, and it has a value of $2,000, then definitely that would be put under supplies. And we'd like to point out that the EPA has developed a guidance. So it's what we call a budget development guidance that would help you create a good budget and help you identify whether it really is a subaward or participant support costs and all that. And there, the link is right there and for you to use. Next row, please. The EPA 5700-54, what that is, that's the EPA contacts list. And when you do your check, make sure that you have the names of the authorized rep, the payee, administrative, and project managers' names all in there. And we'd like to point out that for internal control purposes and for checks and balances, the same individual cannot be identified for all positions. So, because what we do is we do an exclusion check on sam.gov. By exclusion, it means that these are people who are debarred or suspended by federal government to receive any grant funding. Next row, please. The EPA 4700-4, that's your pre-award compliance form. And the main takeaway for this is that make sure that you answered all the questions in there. Another division, which is our Office of, Control, what am I thinking here? It's our ORC. They're the ones who review this format, and they wanted to make sure that you answered all the questions in there. If there's a question in there that does not apply, simply put NA in there and you're good to go. Next row, please. Oh, I just realized Office of Regional Council. So, okay. And then number 6, final approved work plan. This is something that you work closely with your PO. And it's important that you, in your work plan, you list down all the outputs and the outcomes and the deliverables for that project. And then it's also important that there's a budget detail that ties into that because it links. So let's say you're required to do some training workshops. So that's a travel expense. So your budget detail would list down all the travel requirements that you'll have for it. And then next row, please. Current ITCN agreement or the indirect cost negotiation agreement. It's important that if you are going to propose indirect costs for your budget, that you provide a copy of your most current indirect cost negotiation agreement in your grant application package. And please note that indirect cost negotiation agreements that are over 4 years old cannot be used for budgeting purposes. Next row. The EPA 6600-06. So it has already been discuss the certification of lobbying. Make sure that if you're getting a funding of 100,000 more, please include that in your application package. And last row, please. And this one, the last one, is called the disclosure of lobbying activities and or EPA conflict of interest policy. These forms are rare, but not uncommon. If you have a lobbyist working for the tribe, we would require for you to submit this form, or if there are potential conflict of influence or interest, I would say, I'm sorry about that we should be aware of, please submit that form to us. Next slide. So annually, what we do is we always update this application guide, and you usually get that from your PO. And what we do in here is that we provide information about how to submit your application to grants.gov, how to find your FON number, your funding opportunity number. That's what that is. And let's say how to find your assistance number. If it's a PPG, that would be a 6605. And how to get into sam.gov. So all the information, including how to create a budget, are all in this R9 application guide. And we're currently working on it. And you'll be getting it shortly through your PO very, very soon. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, the SF424 is going to be revised so that it has a box there for the UEI form, and also the WeBe form, the women and minority-owned business form will also be revised. So you'll find all of these forms in here. If you Google EPA grants dash grantee forms, you'll find it all in there. Next slide, please. The grants recipients were our main inspiration when we created our grants handbook. And here you'll find chock full of information, everything on how to manage your EPA grants from A to Z, from pre-award, post-award to close out. And it's an easy to read document that we have to confess that we GS and your POs use it very heavily. And if you want a copy, just contact your GS and they'll send it to you. And then on the right, you'll see a training module in there. And we recommend that you've got some new folks coming on board in the tribe who will handle your finances, and your new environmental director to take this module classes. I've taken them myself. They're really, really good, and I highly recommend them. And next slide, please. Well, it concludes my short stint as a presenter, and I'm going to yield the virtual floor to my colleague, Angela, at this point. Angela, it's all yours.
Thank you, Nelly. So it's saying that we have 1 minute and 8 seconds left of the session. And I know that for the purposes of time, the session goes through 11:50. So if any folks have questions in the chat, we can look at them pretty quickly. And of course, if we don't get to it because maybe the system logs us off, we can definitely follow up afterwards. Fareed, did you see anything that was worth mentioning out loud, or?
Angela, the last, the questions have been answered in the chat for the most part. They had one question towards the end about the checklist that Nelly shared. Will that be made available?
Yes, thank you, Nelly. And it looks like she went ahead and uploaded it for, thanks for doing that. Yep. And Nelly, would you mind also including our PowerPoint presentation as well? That way folks can have that reference guide.
Absolutely. I'll do that right now.
And just so everybody has our contact information from all the presenters today, we're going to include it on the slide now. And we just want to thank everybody for joining us this morning and learning a little bit more about grants, the latest and the updates, as well as ways in which you can fast track your application and avoid delays and time spent on your end going back and forth. So with that, oh great, thanks Bola. He put in the chat, all questions have been answered. So it looks like we are at our time. So unless there's anything else, is any other last feedback or? Okay, I think we're good. Oh, thank you all for entertaining us with the poll answers. It looks like some folks did find it helpful. So thank you so much for including that feedback. And it looks like we actually had half and half program managers and half finance officers. So that's pretty cool. So thank you for joining us today, program folks and finance folks. And we hope that because the session is recorded, that you can go back and review it again or share it with other folks. I'm not sure how that works with the conference setup, but I suspect because it's recorded, you can look at, hear it again at a later date. So again, thank you everybody, and it was a pleasure joining you this morning. We hope you found it helpful, and we also look forward to talking to you again in whatever capacity. So have a great rest of your day, everyone, and thanks again.